Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. While the enemy of my enemy may indeed almost always be a friend of value, this logic does not necessarily correlate to the friend of my enemy is automatically my enemy. International relations are, of course, more complicated than any simplistic headline. Nevertheless, not since the end of the Cold War has there emerged such a stark alignment of competing alliances. Israel has sided with and is supported by the US-led coalition of Western nations and some moderate Arab regimes, while Russia has allied itself with China, North Korea, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And though President Putin's motive is his military need in the Ukraine war, there are grave repercussions in the Middle East. To explore them, we have with us from Central Israel, Ambassador Dani Ayalon, who is the co-host of our very own TV7 Middle East Review, Powers and Play co-panelist, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, and the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs here in Jerusalem. It's good to see you, Dani.
Thank you, Jonathan. Always good to be with you.
A pleasure indeed. Also joining us from the United Kingdom, London, retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, formerly the senior director at the National Security Council in Washington and special envoy for Syria, who currently is the founding director of the American Center for Levant Studies. It's good to see you as well, Colonel.
Good to be here.
And with me in the studio, of course, is our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, take it away.
So yes, indeed, shades of the old Cold War, and one doesn't know whether it's back into the refrigerator or conversely being heated up right now. And the alliances are obviously not the same because at one time Iran was on the American side, not so much the British side. Of course, they are quite angry at the Brits, but it was on the American side. And before there was CENTCOM, for a while there was CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, or the Baghdad Pact. This has all changed, and right now Russia is quite needy. It needs North Korean equipment, it needs Iranian equipment and know-how, and of course it needs China, while the US is leading the coalition of the willing in the region, which includes Israel, Egypt, Jordan, some of the Gulf states headed by Saudi Arabia. And it probably does not include Turkey, even though Turkey is a member in, well, approximately good standing of NATO. And we have seen only recently, a couple of weeks ago, on the night of April the 14th, what this coalition can do against the Iranian member of the other coalition during the night of the missiles. Hopefully, we will not have so many examples of the need to demonstrate how this coalition is both willing and able to enforce its will on the other one. But again, one hopes that if the occasion arises, the United States and the others, along with Israel, will be able to withstand the Russian-led coalition.
With regard to the Russian/Chinese-led coalition, I think it's more Chinese-led than Russian-led. Ultimately, there is a dependence from the Chinese side on Middle East oil, energy products, and other products as well. And there is a Russian dependence on China, there is an Iranian dependence on Russia, so on and so forth. So it seems like there is a dependency that has forced this alliance together rather than the US-led Western coalition, which is more of a coalition of the willing. But of course, there is a certain dependency on US security guarantees, nuclear guarantees, and so on that have also to do with history, but also the present intricacies that we're seeing here in the Middle East. But let's start with Ambassador Ayalon. When we're looking on the regional map, and we're talking now about strategic power competition, how would you map it for us?
Well, first of all, I would say that indeed we see here two camps. And, I lump some together, the Chinese and Russians and the Iranians. You can add, from a further distance, maybe even North Korea. ideologically or politically, even South Africa. Basically, you can talk about the BRICS minus India. And all these countries that in the BRICS, and again, minus India, it is true that they are interdependent in terms of strategy, in terms of economy. But I think what puts them together more than anything else, what binds them together, is an ideology. The ideology is to bring down the West, to bring down the United States, actually to flatten the earth, and actually for China to become the next superpower. So if we talk about the American century of the 20th, they would like to have a Chinese century, if not the 21st, certainly the 22nd century. So to all this now, we have a battlefield. Right now, the battlefield is in the Middle East. It's not something that has been planned premeditatively, but just as a matter of happenstance. Right now, this is the flashpoint, just as the flashpoint could be Ukraine in Europe or Taiwan in the future in the Far East. Right now, we are right here. We see basically that the war is not between Israel and Hamas, and not even between Israel and Iran. We see here the two camps, as you mentioned, Jonathan, the American-led coalition, and on the other side, you have maybe not as well organized as our camp at this point in China, of course. And we saw these two camps actually coming into a real test on the first on the 7th of October, and secondly on the April 14th. I think it's more interesting to look at April 14th, because in April 14th, what did we see? We see a real superiority of the American-led camp in terms of operational integrity, interfacing of all the countries which are in this ad hoc so far alliance. We see a superiority on technology. And on the other hand, we saw Iran pretty much showing itself to be very vulnerable operationally, militarily as a consequence, and most of all, technologically. So at this point, I think we are much ahead. We have the Gaza thing, but the Gaza is solvable. We have more internal, I would say, debates with our own camp, mostly with the United States, maybe with Saudi Arabia, than with the others. We do see also the rivalry where the Chinese and the Russians are trying their best to get a real foot in the door in the Middle East. We saw just last month how Russia in Moscow actually had a convention of all the terror Islamist organizations, whether it's the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, all those other Islamists in Moscow, in order to really gain some kind of synergy and momentum. We just see today, actually, or this week, in China, actually they are trying to preside over some kinds of negotiations between Fatah and Hamas. And this is in the wake of their political coup from last year, when actually they presided over the rapprochement and the renewal of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So we see that they're still trying to encroach, but again, because of what I said before, in terms of the superiority on all categories, that the American-led camp is ahead, is going to be ahead. And I think that after the Gaza war is over, we're going to see a totally different Middle East, but it very much depends on what the Israeli government wants to get out of it.
I think it also takes more than two to tango in this equation, since ultimately we need to see how the Islamic Republic of Iran is going to react subsequent to the culmination of the war in Gaza, Hezbollah for that matter, and other proxies, including Ansar Allah or the Houthis in Yemen. And at the same time, with one remark that I have to say, I think in contrast to the United States, which is self-sufficient pretty much in every sector and sphere, China is not, and it's very heavily reliant on multiple elements from the Middle East and other unstable regions, which maintains a certain status of a very fragile reality from its self-sustainability angle. And therefore, to have such a country as China opt to become a peer of the United States, I'm more than skeptical. But Colonel Rayburn, when you look at the Middle East, how do you map it?
Let's take, first of all, I love Danny's analysis there, and there's nothing there that I disagree with. Let us say more and more the strategic thinkers and scholars in the United States are contemplating the danger of a confrontation between the United States and China in the future based on China's apparently aggressive policy of trying to dominate the Pacific, but also, as Danny said, to essentially supervise a coalition of revanchist states that would like to dissolve the post-World War II U.S.-led international order and international security system and regional security systems where they exist, such as in the Gulf and NATO, and so on. So, in the event of such a cataclysmic clash between the United States and China, and I hope to God it doesn't happen, but if it were, if we think about that scenario, China cannot sustain itself in terms of fuel, first and foremost. It requires fuel, it requires oil coming from the Persian Gulf region in order to fuel its economy, and certainly in the event of a war. The United States oversees a U.S.-led security system in the Gulf, and it makes no sense whatsoever for the United States to abandon that primacy in the Gulf region, which is essentially sitting astride China's fuel pump, gas pump, certainly in a time of conflict. China, on the other hand, I think would like to see the United States. I think it's a serious objective of China to see the United States military expelled from the Gulf region so that its ally, Iran, can then control the keys to China's gas pump on China's behalf, so that fuel supply that China needs to live is secured, so that it can push forward with this confrontation with the United States and our allies in the Pacific. I think it's strategic. That's the first order of business, and that's why I think that's the most important reason why it makes no sense for strategists to be talking about the United States need to reduce its involvement in the Middle East, or that the Middle East is tangential to this great power competition that's going on. Now, secondly, if we look at, so then I think both China and Russia are supporting Iran's objectives in the Middle East, which where they have this shared strategic objective of expelling the United States, compelling the United States from this strategic region, and then realigning the states of the region into vassalage from this coalition of China, Russia, and the Iranian regime. Now, in order to carry that out, the Iranian regime has to neutralize Israel. It has to blackmail, neutralize other U.S. allies in the region. The only thing that the Iranian regime has in order to carry that out are the axis of resistance forces, its proxy forces, proxy armies, and its missile arsenal. If you think about what the Iranian regime what it can use that would be an existential threat to Israel or to other U.S. allies in the region, these are the only two. Drones, I think, are sophisticated. They're not an existential military threat, but the missile arsenal could be. That's why what happened on the night of April 13th and 14th, I think, was so important, strategically speaking, and will have far-reaching implications, because it essentially, I think, in the first test of the Iranians, one of their two existential threats to Israel, with the help of the United States and other allies, was able to defang that strategic threat. So all of the investment that the Iranian regime has made for decades into this missile arsenal, the night of April 13th and 14th indicated that it may be doing the Iranian regime no good. That in terms of a deterrent, or in terms of an offensive weapon that it can use against Israel, this may be meaningless. if Iranian missiles, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles can simply be shot down at the rate of 98% or more, then essentially the Iranian regime does not have that tool as a strategic deterrent. All that it has then is its close forces, its axis of resistance forces closer to the Israeli border, which would use the same weapons, but try to employ them in a way that the Soviets threatened to do from Cuba against the United States in the Cuban Missile Crisis, to have missiles, rockets, and drones located close enough to Israel to be able to launch a surprise attack and overwhelm Israel's missile and drone defenses that way. That's the only game left in town, I think, for the Iranian regime as a strategic deterrent or an offensive weapon. That means if we look at the border conflict, at the conflict that's on the Lebanese border, the Iranian regime is going to fight very hard to maintain Hezbollah's presence on the Israeli border, because if Hezbollah is forced back from the border and no longer can have the same kind of quick surprise attack reach into Israel, then both of the Iranian regime's major existential threats to Israel, major prongs of its deterrent are gone. The only option that the Iranian regime would have in that scenario is to race for a nuclear weapon capability. And I think that is something that they have to be seriously considering after the night of April 13th and 14th.
I completely agree with pretty much everything you said, but I'd like to ask you, Mr. Oren, a couple of things. First of all, China has invested some $400 billion over the course of 25 years in Iranian infrastructure, basically at the low point of Iran's economy during the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration. The Ayatollah regime basically capitulated and sold most of its strategic infrastructure to the Chinese. And within that context, we see that China is indeed promoting Iran, whether it is selling all kind of media packages of disinformation, the way I see it, of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards as the peace force in the Strait of Hormuz or other areas, and trying to trickle that information into Western civilization to try and convince the West, at least the public or the misinformed public, that Iran is a member of good standing within the international community, which it's not. Now, I'd like to hear your opinion on that and on another point, and that is Henry Kissinger leveraged Israeli qualitative capabilities and maneuvering during the Great Middle East War in order to draw Egypt to the Western camp. Within that context, we see the Egyptians now struggling economically, particularly because of the Iranian maneuver via its proxy in Yemen on the Red Sea, abrupting pretty much 50% of maritime shipping through the straits, which ultimately Egypt is very heavily reliant upon.
Starting with your second point, I beg to differ. It was Sadat who courted the United States rather than the other way around. Kissinger, as well as Nixon, were surprised when in July of 1972, Sadat expelled the Soviet advisors without asking anything from Washington. Sadat wanted to get into the American orbit. He wanted to open up his economy, the infitah, and many other reasons. But of course, the consequence was very positive for the United States.
Noted.
Now, then he said that it's BRICS without the I. Let me suggest another acronym. Icarus, Iran, China, and Russia. And of course, there's a warning there. Don't fly too high to the sun because you're going to crash to the ground. Now, China, of course, has quite an ambition, even though one is not certain whether President Xi will be remembered as a successful leader or a failure. Of course, when the historians who come after him write history. Right now, he's the greatest leader since Deng Xiaoping, at least. But China is concentrating, first of all, on its strategic environs. Doesn't matter whether it's the first island chain, second island chain, Philippines, Taiwan, and all of that. This is its main focus. Of course, it would like to get fishing rights in Africa and who knows what where. But if there is indeed a Russian-Chinese camp, which we have not seen since the time of Mao and Khrushchev, then Russia wants to be the leader in Europe, and China wants to be the leader in the Indo-Pacific. And then we'll take Manhattan.
Ambassador Ayalon, along the lines of your distinguished curriculum vitae, you also served as the chief foreign policy advisor to the prime minister here in Jerusalem. And as such, if you were in that capacity today, what would you advise the prime minister vis-a-vis the strategic power competition layout and the way Israel should contend with it?
Well, I would advise wholeheartedly to look at the bigger picture. Gaza is almost, I would say, tactical, if I may say that. Saudi Arabia is strategic. And the cementing the American-led camp is strategic in terms of not just having a much better future for the region in terms of stability, prosperity, and of course security, also in isolating Iran. I think there is a pathway here. And the pathway, as President Biden suggested, is first and foremost to finish the war in Gaza, a ceasefire, as a segue to changing, I would say, the governing of Gaza. If Israel wants to really do away with Hamas, not just as a military power, but also as a political entity, we must have somebody there in lieu of Hamas, and that could only be a Palestinian force. This is why a Palestinian authority, which is an anathema to most Israelis, and rightly so, but here we can put some conditions. The Americans also volunteered a new term, which is called a revitalized Palestinian Authority. We can just look at the nitty-gritty of what is a revitalized Palestinian Authority that can take over Gaza. Once we have Gaza under, let's say, some new regime and stability and no danger of Hamas or Islamic Jihad attacking Israel, then that could be a segue. An arrangement in Gaza could be a segue to bring about normalization with Saudi Arabia, the rest of the Gulf countries, other major Muslim countries like Indonesia, for instance, and of course think about the economic corridor and security and defense cooperation as we have done. We see here a combination of the Trump policy, where with the Abraham Accord, and also very importantly, with bringing Israel under the, let's say, the auspices of CENTCOM and not EUCOM, this has changed strategically the region, the security in the region. So in order to go in that path, we have to finish Gaza, open Saudi Arabia, and I know it's very, very difficult, but it can be done.
By the way, maybe the United States needs more of an Abrams Accords, the Abrams tank. When it rolls on, it has sometimes more power than any Abrams Accord.
Indeed. Well, I actually disagree with that statement, even though
no, it was just because of the pun. I don't agree with myself.
Okay, good. Colonel Rayburn, there is not much time left, and I'd like to hear what would you advise, or what will you advise to the next administration in Washington to contend with seeing the Chinese now traveling to Egypt, trying to deepen the strategic engagement with the Egyptians, looking and courting Saudi Arabia and other strategic allies and partners of the United States in the Middle East, and elsewhere for that matter? How would you contend with such a reality?
I think the Biden, first of all, avoid the mistakes that the Biden administration made in its first 2 years, which is rather than pull together traditional U.S. allies in the region and synchronize their policies and strategic outlook and so on. Essentially, relations between the Biden administration and Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel were frayed from the very beginning, and they still, I don't think, have recovered from that mistake and lost a lot of time. I don't see the upside. If I'm putting myself in the shoes of decision makers in Riyadh, I don't see the upside to a normalization deal right now brokered with the United States in the absence of a real commitment from the United States to deter the Iranian regime from its regional provocative, aggressive behavior, which should be the ordering principle and the unifying threat of these allies that they should be combining towards. But I just don't see signs that the Biden administration is in that same place, that same sort of thinking. They're not enforcing sanctions on the Iranian regime in terms of its oil revenues. The Washington Post reported today that they blocked sanctions being imposed by Congress on the Assad regime, and they're sort of soft pedaling around Hezbollah in Lebanon, and when they should be, I think, taking a hard stance and creating the pressure on this axis of resistance. So my advice, whether it's to the current administration or a future one, which I hope there is a new administration next year, that there's got that essential that's the magic ingredient in whether it's an Abraham Accords, involving Saudi Arabia, or it's cobbling together better a regional alliance to defend the rest of these countries against Iran. Is the United States has to lead in using its superpower tools, which are not just military but also very much economic and political, against the Iranian regime. And it's just not being done right now.
There will probably be a second-term presidency, either Biden's or Trump's. So maybe by a new presidency, Joel is referring to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Well, let's not go
I'm ready
far
to make a bet with you on that one, Amir.
All right. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Ambassador Ayalon, Colonel Rayburn, and Mr. Oren. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.